Welcome to week 3 of ENVU 3150, Environmental Decision Making. This week we are going to begin our lectures on descriptive models of decision making with a description of the effect of heuristics. Our learning objectives this week are to enable you to differentiate among normative, descriptive, and prescriptive decision strategies, to enable you to apply an appropriate decision strategy to an environmental issue, to justify an environmental decision outcome using rational, legal, and ethical criteria, and explain how heuristics and biases affect environmental decisions. In contrast with normative models, which we covered in week 2 of the class, we are going to now begin to explore descriptive models, which describe how people actually make decisions. And there are two primary areas we're going to look at. The first is something called prospect theory, which is centered on loss aversion and two biases, the status quo bias and the framing bias. And the second area is heuristics, or rules of thumb. We're going to look at availability, representativeness, anchoring and adjustment, and affect and dual processing. Prospect theory is a well-known theory in decision making, and it applies to many environmental decisions. Prospect theory is comprised of three elements. It is the tendency to overweight outcomes that are certain relative to outcomes that are probable. In other words, we prefer certainty. It is a tendency to place a higher absolute value on losses relative to equivalent gains. In other words, we value what we might lose more than what we might gain. And it is a tendency to judge losses and gains relative to an easily accessible reference point, such as one's current situation. So we look at things from what we would call first person or our own reference point. Prospect theory is affected by something called the status quo bias. The status quo bias is the reluctance to adopt new behaviors or give up property already in our possession. And the status quo bias, in turn, is the result of something called the endowment effect. And the endowment effect is based on the emotional attachment we have to property or ideas, and we give property or ideas that we already possess a higher value than those we do not possess. So we value what we have more than what we don't have. An example would be our favorite sweater, perhaps, or our favorite book, something that we have. The framing bias is the bias that's induced by the presentation of information using a specific perspective so that only certain aspects are shown or highlighted. Now, the framing bias and the status quo bias are two of the elements that shift us away from the normative models of rationality and bounded rationality and into a world where we are using a more, I guess, a human approach based on our fallibilities, which is prospect theory. And so we're beginning to move away now from the purely normative or theoretical approaches into what actually happens when we make decisions. So what the framing bias does in terms of prospect theory is it shifts our perspective on gains and losses. And as Tversky and Kahneman said in 1981, choices involving gains are often risk averse, and choices involving losses are often risk taking. In other words, if we are risk averse, we tend to avoid risk and loss when information about a choice is framed as a gain. In other words, adding something. In other words, we prefer certainty when we look at our gains. And risk-taking is that we tend to seek risks when information about a choice is framed as a loss, in other words, removing something. So we look at gains from a risk-averse perspective. we would prefer these certain gains. And when we look at losses, we look at them from a risk-taking perspective. In other words, we are willing to risk more losses than we are willing to risk certain gains. So this is kind of a subtle distinction, but let's take a look at an example. Let's imagine that the U.S. is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual Asian disease which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Let's assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the programs are as follows. So in this experiment, which was actually done in 1981, about half the respondents received the following description of the programs using a survival or a gain frame. So if program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. And if program B is adopted, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. 72% expressed a preference for program A, the risk-averse alternative. So what we see is a bias towards gains when a situation is framed as gains. The second part of the experiment was the second half of the participants received a description. This is the same exact programs, except it uses a loss frame, mortality. So if program C is adopted, 400 people will die. If program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. And in actuality, these are the exact same choices. So only 22% of the people who got the loss frame or the mortality frame opted for program C, even though it's the same risk-averse alternative as program A. And program D is the same risk-seeking alternative as program B. So this experiment shows us that there is a general tendency for people to be risk-averse when exposed to a gains or survival frame, and risk-seeking when exposed to a losses mortality frame. In other words, when we are confronted with a possible loss, we will tend to take more risks. And when we are confronted with a possible gain, we will tend to go for what is certain rather than take a risk for what is more. This is just a generally noticed approach based on how situations are framed. So loss aversion is the result of two biases, and loss aversion is the basis of prospect theory. And we can take a look at this chart and we can understand a little bit about loss aversion. So if we have a possible gain of $500, we would value that from our own perspective at an intrinsic value of 60. But if we have a loss of $500, we will value that at $120, which is twice the value that we would ascribe to the same gain. And the same holds for greater gains. A gain of 750 is valued at 85, but a loss of 750 is valued at negative 170. And a gain of 1,000 is valued at approximately 92, somewhere around there. But a loss of 1,000 is valued at negative 210. These are just on the Y scale here. These are just relative units of value with the how much value would you assign to a particular loss, or how important is this gain to you. These are just relative subjective units. They're not any particular units of measure. And so we see that the status quo bias, our preference for the status quo, for keeping what we have, and our framing bias, which is framing something as a gain. We prefer certainty in gains, and we prefer we will take risks when we look at losses. What we get is something called loss aversion. So in our decisions, we tend to be averse to losses. In other words, we don't want to lose what we already have. This is important for environmental decision making in a number of reasons because decisions that are framed as gains will be seen as less important. The outcomes will be seen less important as those that are framed as losses. We'll see this occur in a number of our issues in the text. Heuristics are another aspect of decision making, which is it's important to understand. And a heuristic is a rule of thumb or a decision shortcut. And a lot of times we will use these subconsciously, especially if we practice them very often. Hopefully, heuristics will lead to a correct outcome, and they're known as decision strategies. And some examples from Polya in 1945 are, these are three very common examples in learning theory. If you're having difficulty understanding a problem, try drawing a picture, because then what you do is you shift into a different mode of learning. If you can't find a solution, try assuming that you have a solution and seeing what you can derive from that, working backwards. This is based on our activating our creative energies. Now, if the problem is abstract, try examining a concrete example. This is shifting from deductive to inductive reasoning. Actually, it's shifting from deductive to inductive and inducing from an example a more general solution. The problem with heuristics is that while they do offer a means of solving a particular problem, you have to be careful in using them because rules of thumb can induce one or more biases. And so while they're useful, realize that they have their limitations and that we have to be careful when we're using them. Here's one very common one. For example, grocery shopping. You're purchasing 3 items at the store, $19.95 for 1, $39.98 for 2, and $29.97 for 3. If you are trying to figure out how much money you're spending, then you're going to use the rounding heuristic. And the fastest way to solve this is just to round off and approximate. And you do get a nice approximation here. So we have 20 plus 40 is 60, plus 30 is 90. However, realize that you're inducing some errors. In other words, you're getting rounding errors. And this is the equivalent of bias. And so while heuristics can be useful, the results aren't always completely accurate. The availability heuristic is a very common one in our thinking. And it's our tendency to estimate the probability that an event will occur based on how easily a similar event can be remembered or visualized. If something has recently happened to us, then the availability heuristic will kick in because we'll remember it easily. We tend to rely on what we already know as a basis for making a decision. And so this heuristic, while it could be useful, can also induce a bias because every decision situation is different. Every context is different. There are certain details that are present that were not present before. There's certain aspects of it that are slightly different. And this heuristic will induce a kind of a shortcut bias because we will tend not to consider all the aspects of the current decision. Emotionally charged and vividly remembered events are easily remembered and therefore more likely to influence decisions about similar events. And so we will tend to go back to what we remember from as having occurred to us as having a great impact. And if an event is easy to recall, then we will tend to overestimate how often it actually occurs. And this is this heuristic is reinforced by some of the events in the news media, and perhaps some of the events that we've encountered in our lives, and results in our use of recent memories or vivid memories instead of looking at all of the aspects of a particular situation or considering other similar events that relate to the particular decision context. Representativeness is another heuristic, and this is the tendency to group elements according to a conceptual pattern. this is the old adage, you can tell a book by its cover. Well, you can tell a certain amount about a book by its cover, but not all of it. Again, we're inducing a bias. And representativeness is an estimate of the likelihood that an event or an individual belongs in a specific category. And this is seen in something what we find in Las Vegas and Atlantic City called the gambler's fallacy. Seeing a pattern when none exists based on an incorrect perception of randomness, i.e. something like a hot table. The table's hot, people are winning, let's go play. However, it's an incorrect perception of random events. This representativeness heuristic results in stereotyping and classification. And we tend to judge a person or an event according to how closely it resembles our stereotypical conception of a similar person or event. And the result of this heuristic is that we tend to confuse randomness and causal patterns. In other words, we see causes, we see patterns when none exists. And so what we're doing is we're projecting out on reality what we assume to be true about reality. But this is actually based on previous beliefs and previous experiences, the principles that we hold close to us. Another heuristic is something called anchoring and adjustment. And anchoring happens when we are exposed to a value for an unknown quantity before estimating that unknown quantity. What we do is, after seeing that value, we adjust our estimate of what we think to be the likely outcome based on the anchor value to which we have been exposed. The key here is the validity of the anchor point. This effect is more severe in situations about which we know very little. When we self-select an anchor, the availability heuristic kicks in, and so when we are given an anchor, we will tend to use that anchor subconsciously and move from that anchor to estimate a particular value. And these are the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is based on two effects. One is the priming effect, which is that the exposure to a stimulus influences one's response to a subsequent similar stimulus. And insufficient adjustment, this is conservation of energy, that we choose the closest plausible value. So what we tend to do is, well, we'll see a value, we'll be exposed to it, we'll be asked to estimate a new value based on the value to which we have been exposed, and we will tend to adjust based on that particular anchor. A very important and relevant heuristic is known as affect and dual processing. And this affects the majority of people, and it's a difficult one, it takes practice to overcome, because we tend to make decisions using mostly our emotions instead of our logical faculties. And this is a very common heuristic because it's easy. It conserves energy. It also relates to the availability. We can just relate to a previous emotional experience. But again, it's like the picture of the iceberg where the majority is underwater. The majority of our decision making is emotional and with our rational faculties not being used. But we can overcome this and understand what's going on. The experiential method of making decisions is an emotional method. We associate the current event or the current decision to past events based on how we felt about them. We will see an outcome as good or bad. These decisions will happen quickly. They're intuitive. There will be immediate action taken to resolve. The decision is also self-evident. The outcome is self-evident because experiencing is believing in terms of this decision. And the way in which we interpret information is centered on images, metaphors, and narratives. And so this is the experiential method or the emotional basis for making decisions. The analytic method is more rational, logical. We use reasoning and deliberation. The analytical method is good for representing complex issues because it is a conscious appraisal of the factors that go into it. We use symbols, words, formulas, and numbers. However, this approach is slow. It requires effort, justification using logic and evidence. And the key to good decision making is to use both systems of processing to assess an outcome. In other words, how do we feel about it? What's our emotional reaction? And then how do we logically reason our way through this? So dual processing is important. Just realize that the heuristic induces a bias towards emotionality, and that we need to balance that with reason. So in conclusion, the heuristics that we use can have many benefits, but also induce biases. So the lesson here is to be aware of how you're thinking about a situation. What heuristic am I using? What is it that I'm placing on the situation that enables me to work through it more quickly? And strive to become aware of the biases to which your thinking is subject based on the heuristics that you're using. Once we are aware of our biases, then we can look at a decision outcome in a little bit different light based on the process that we use, or perhaps adopt a slightly different process.